I didn't go to the park that afternoon looking for anything. It was one of those days when my thoughts felt scattered, and the only remedy I knew was to sit on the old wooden bench beneath the tall elm tree with a coffee in one hand and my notebook in the other. The air was sharp with the first hints of autumn, and every gust of wind sent a wave of leaves tumbling across the path in shades of amber and rust. It was then I noticed her. She walked with the kind of grace that doesn't try to draw attention, yet somehow does. A scarf was loosely knotted around her neck, its edges fluttering in the breeze as she slowed near the benches. Her steps weren't hurried, her posture quiet but assured. And for some reason I couldn't name, I found myself watching her more closely than I usually allow myself to watch strangers. Our eyes met. Not in the casual way people's gazes sometimes collide in public spaces, quickly darting away with a polite smile. No, this was different. Her eyes, warm, steady, carrying something I couldn't quite decipher, held mine as though she recognized me. The strangest thing was that it didn't feel intrusive. It felt deliberate, familiar even. I looked down, suddenly aware of my own breath, pretending to scribble something in the notebook that I hadn't even opened yet. But curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced up again. She was still there, pausing near the bench across from mine, her gaze lingering a moment longer before she slowly turned to continue her walk. It left me unsettled in the gentlest way. I couldn't shake the impression that she had been waiting for me. Not literally, perhaps, but in the sense that my presence hadn't surprised her. There was no flicker of hesitation, no cautious appraisal like people often give each other. Just that calm, steady recognition, like I was already a character in a story she had been reading for a while. The rest of the park blurred. Children's laughter from the playground, the steady flap of pigeons' wings, the crunch of leaves beneath joggers' shoes. All of it became distant. What stayed sharp was the sound of the wind tugging at her scarf, the faint trace of her perfume that lingered as she passed by, and the quiet weight of being seen. I tried to return to my coffee, to the notebook in my lap, but the words refused to come. Instead, I replayed that gaze again and again. What had she seen in me? Why did it feel like she already knew? For the first time in a long while, sitting on that bench didn't feel solitary. It felt as though some invisible thread had been stretched across the space between us. And though I didn't yet know her name, I already sensed that this wasn't the last time our paths would cross. The next time I saw her, I told myself it was coincidence. The park had always been a place where strangers overlapped, where the same faces appeared on the same benches at the same hours without ever truly meeting. And yet, when I spotted her again, I felt the quiet tug of inevitability. She walked her familiar path, scarf tied a little neater this time, hair pinned back, but still loose enough for the wind to tease strands across her face. I tried to look casual, though the truth is I was waiting for the moment her eyes would find mine again. And when they did, it was as though the space between us folded in, silent but certain. This time, though, she didn't continue on. Instead, she stopped, glanced at the empty half of my bench, and lowered herself onto the wood with an ease that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. The faint creak of the bench beneath her weight sounded louder than it should have. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world around us went about its business, dogs tugging on leashes, children chasing soccer balls, the distant roll of a bicycle's wheels on gravel. Yet between us stretched a pause that felt like it could shape the entire day. "Lovely weather today," she said finally. Her voice was calm, carrying the kind of richness that only comes from years of speaking softly but with purpose. I nodded, but something about the simple phrase struck me. It wasn't just small talk, it was an opening, an invitation. "It is," I answered. "The kind of day that makes you want to sit and do nothing." Her lips curved, not into a full smile, but something quieter, like she appreciated the honesty. We both looked out at the same stretch of park as though it were suddenly worth studying. The way the sunlight flickered through leaves, the way the breeze carried the faint scent of grass freshly cut. Her hand brushed the bench near mine as she shifted slightly, fingers tracing the wood without thought. I felt the space between our hands like a charged silence. Not touching, not even close enough for skin to graze, but near enough to stir a strange awareness in me. I wondered if she felt it too. Her perfume drifted lightly, not strong, just the faintest hint of something floral, like jasmine after dusk. It was enough to anchor me, enough to make her presence linger even when neither of us spoke. We sat like that for several minutes, exchanging no more than a handful of words. Yet, somehow, the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, steady, and alive with the sense that we had already said much more than our voices could manage. When she eventually stood, smoothing the folds of her coat, she glanced at me once more, her gaze warm but unreadable. Then she walked away, leaving behind the faint memory of her perfume and the sharper memory of her nearness. And I realized something. A stranger had just made the park feel different. Not larger, not smaller, but suddenly significant. That it didn't take long before our brief exchanges turned into longer ones. At first, it was always something simple, a comment about the weather, a passing remark about how quickly the trees were changing color. But slowly, the conversation stretched, as though neither of us was quite ready to stand and leave once they began. By the third or fourth meeting, it felt natural when she lowered herself onto the bench beside me, her coat brushing lightly against my sleeve. I noticed how she carried herself with quiet composure, as though the world expected her to be strong, and she had grown accustomed to that role. But every so often, in the spaces between her words, there was a softness, a trace of something unguarded. That afternoon, her gaze lingered on the playground across the path. Children shouted, their laughter spilling into the air, tangled with the metallic creak of swings. She watched for a moment before saying, almost under her breath, "I used to come here with my husband. He liked this spot." Her voice didn't break, but I heard the pause, the careful way she said it. I turned slightly toward her, not wanting to pry but wanting her to know I was listening. "I'm sorry," I said gently. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It's been a few years now, and still somehow, I find myself here more often than anywhere else. Strange, isn't it? How certain places hold on to us." Her words settled into me with surprising weight. I'd only known her for days, and yet the image of her sitting here in solitude, returning again and again to a memory that was both tender and painful, stirred something I couldn't ignore. "I think that makes sense," I said softly. "This place, it feels safe, like it's holding a memory for you." She glanced at me then, her eyes softer than before. A small laugh escaped her, not loud, not careless, but quiet and honest, like the sound had been waiting a long time. "And you? What brings you here, always with that notebook?" I looked down at the closed pages in my lap. "Mostly confusion," I admitted, my mouth tugging at a wry smile. "When I don't know what to do with my thoughts, I come here. It feels like they settle more easily under the trees than they do in my apartment." For a moment, she studied me as if weighing the truth of my words. And then she nodded, as though she understood more than I'd said aloud. The wind picked up, carrying a loose strand of her hair across her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear with slow precision. I felt the smallest urge to reach out, to do it for her, but held myself back. Still, that hesitation carried its own charge. And in that pause, I realized something simple but undeniable. She was no longer just a stranger on a bench. She was becoming my refuge too. The day the rain came, the park was nearly empty. The laughter of children, the joggers' steady rhythm, the dogs straining at leashes, all of it had vanished, replaced by the muted patter of water on leaves and the damp hush that follows a sudden downpour. I almost turned back when I saw the clouds gather, but something, maybe hope, maybe habit, pulled me toward our bench anyway. And there she was. She stood beneath a tree, one hand gripping a closed umbrella, the other brushing raindrops from her sleeve. The sight of her, elegant even in the gray drizzle, made me forget the weather entirely. "Didn't expect to see you today," I said as I approached. Her lips curved faintly, though she didn't answer right away. Instead, she flicked open her umbrella and held it out, tilting it slightly so I could step under. "Well," she murmured, "rain is easier to bear when it's shared." I slid closer, our shoulders brushing as the umbrella forced us nearer than we'd ever been before. Her coat was cool and damp against my jacket, and I could feel the warmth of her presence humming beneath the fabric. For a while, we simply walked along the gravel path, the rain pattering a soft rhythm above us. Every step made me more aware of her. The gentle sway of her arm, the faint trace of perfume that seemed somehow stronger in the damp air, the closeness that left no room for pretense. And yet, with every inch of nearness came a pull of hesitation, an invisible line neither of us seemed ready to cross. She slowed suddenly, her eyes drifting to the ground as though following the raindrops. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how life can feel both heavy and light in moments like these. I'm not sure I've walked under an umbrella with anyone since." Her voice trailed off, but the silence finished the sentence for her. I wanted to say something, to tell her how natural it felt, How right, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I adjusted the umbrella, shifting it so she was more covered than me. It was a small gesture, but when she glanced up, the way her eyes softened told me she noticed. The silence stretched, heavy but not empty. Her arm brushed mine again, deliberate or accidental. I couldn't be sure. My pulse quickened, the kind of rush that comes when you know you're on the edge of something, but aren't certain whether to step forward or retreat. Then, almost as if she felt the same tension, she pulled back slightly, creating the faintest sliver of space between us. Her breath left her in a quiet sigh, and the warmth of her body faded just enough to remind me of its absence. The rain continued, steady and unrelenting, but inside the circle of that umbrella the world felt suspended. I wanted to reach for her hand, to bridge that gap, but I stayed still, caught between the safety of restraint and the risk of honesty. That was the day I realized. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't saying too much. It's holding back what your heart already knows. The rain had passed by the time we met again. The park had dried into that golden stillness that comes after storms. Everything sharp, washed clean, and touched with the soft glow of the evening sun. I found myself on the bench first this time, pretending to read, though my eyes never moved across the page. They were waiting for her. When she appeared, I noticed something different. Her steps were slower, thoughtful, as though she carried the weight of a memory she couldn't quite set down. She sat beside me without a word, her coat brushing mine, and let out a breath that felt heavier than usual. For a while, we watched the light fade across the trees. Then she spoke. "My husband loved this hour," she said, her eyes tracing the horizon. "He used to call it the golden moment, that time of day when everything looks softer, kinder." Her voice wavered slightly, just enough for me to feel it. And in that small tremor, I sensed a grief that hadn't gone, only quieted over the years. Instinct guided me before thought could interfere. I turned my hand slowly, deliberately, and placed it over hers where it rested in her lap. Her skin was warm, her fingers cool from the breeze. She stiffened at first, just a fraction, a reflex of surprise, and I almost pulled away. But then she let her hand remain, her fingers shifting slightly, not entwining with mine, but not retreating either. The contact was subtle, quiet, yet it carried a weight far greater than its simplicity. We sat like that for long moments, the warmth of our hands speaking a language neither of us dared to put into words. "I don't know why I told you that," she murmured, her gaze still fixed on the fading light. "Because you wanted to," I said softly. She turned her head then, meeting my eyes. There was something raw in her expression, a mixture of vulnerability and resolve, as though she was testing whether I could bear to see the pieces she usually kept hidden. I held her gaze, refusing to look away. The air between us thickened, charged. I felt her fingers shift again, this time pressing just slightly into my palm. Not a grip, not a promise, but enough to say she hadn't mistaken the moment. Enough to say she felt it too. Her breath caught, quiet but unmistakable. My own heartbeat stumbled in response, loud enough in my chest that I wondered if she could hear it. And yet, just as quickly, she turned her face away, her hand loosening beneath mine, but not leaving it altogether. A fragile balance, closeness without claim, desire without confession. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the grass. Still, neither of us moved. The golden hour had ended, but something else had begun, something neither of us had named. Yet both of us understood that by the time autumn deepened, the park had changed. The trees stood half bare, their branches reaching like dark veins into the gray sky. The air carried a sharper bite, and the ground was littered with brittle leaves that crunched beneath every step. I arrived at our bench with my hands shoved deep in my coat pockets, wondering if she would come. She did. Her scarf was pulled tighter around her neck this time, her hair pinned more carefully than usual, as though she had armored herself for the day. When she sat, there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. Not much, but enough to feel. We made small talk at first. About the cold. About how quickly the year had passed. But the words felt thin, stretched too tightly over something heavier. Finally, she drew in a slow breath and said, "I need to be honest with you." My chest tightened. I braced myself. "I think about this about us more than I should," she continued, her voice low. Her eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead, watching a couple stroll by with their dog. "And when I do, I hear this voice in my head, telling me I'm too old for this, that people would laugh if they knew, that I'd be foolish to let it go further." Her words pierced me, not because I hadn't thought them myself, but because hearing them aloud made them real. I swallowed hard, searching for the right response. Do you really care what people would think? I asked quietly. She turned to me then, and her eyes shone with something fierce and vulnerable all at once. I wish I didn't, but I do. I've lived too many years caring. And yet, her voice faltered. She pressed her lips together before finishing. And yet, being here with you feels more honest than anything I've known in a long time. The admission hit me like a weight and a release all at once. My hands trembled slightly, though I hid them in my lap. I don't care, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I don't care about the numbers or what people whisper. I care that when I sit here with you, I don't feel lost anymore. I feel like I belong to something, to someone. Her eyes glistened, and for a moment, I thought she might reach for me. Instead, she clutched the strap of her bag as though it were the only thing keeping her steady. The silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable. The lamps along the path flickered on, casting halos of pale light across the damp ground. I could hear her breathing, shallow but steady, and my own heart beating loud against the quiet. This was the breaking point, the moment where we could step back into safety or lean into the risk of something neither of us could undo. And sitting there, caught in her gaze, I knew the choice wasn't mine alone. The park had grown quiet in the early evening. The golden light of late autumn had given way to a soft twilight, and the lamps along the path cast gentle pools of warmth on the damp leaves. I arrived at our bench with a slow, deliberate pace, unsure if she would be here yet, though I had a sense she would be. And there she was. Her coat was buttoned, scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, but the tension I had seen in her eyes the day before had softened. She was seated on the edge of the bench, hands folded loosely in her lap, as if waiting for permission to simply exist beside someone without the weight of expectation. I sat down quietly, close enough that our arms brushed. She didn't move away. For a long moment, we just watched the park in silence. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and something floral, subtle enough to remind me of her presence without overwhelming the moment. Then she turned her head slightly and allowed her cheek to rest lightly against my shoulder. The touch was so soft, so careful, that I felt the warmth radiate from her and settle into me. It was not a claim, not a declaration, but a surrender of sorts, a quiet acceptance that this moment, and perhaps many more like it, belonged to us. I let my arms slide around her, resting gently across her back. It was protective, yes, but also grounding, as though the simple act of holding her close could steady the weight of our separate lives. She inhaled softly, a sound almost swallowed by the rustle of leaves, and I could feel her heartbeat, steady and slow against mine. We didn't speak at first. Words weren't needed. The world had shrunk to the span of that bench, to the gentle press of her body against me, to the subtle give and take of breaths in rhythm. Every detail, the faint brush of hair from her face, the way her scarf caught the fading light, the subtle shift of her hand along my sleeve, felt magnified, precious. Finally, she whispered, I wasn't sure we could. I didn't know if we should. I shook my head slightly, pressing my lips to the top of her head in a gesture that was more promise than comfort. Here, now it's right. That's all that matters. Her lips curved into a small, serene smile. The tension that had followed her for so long seemed to melt, leaving only quiet contentment. She nestled closer, and I held her without thinking, letting the world outside the park fade away. For the first time, I felt the full weight of being seen and accepted. Not as a young man or a widow, not as a stranger or a cautious observer, but as two people who had found something rare and steady in each other's presence. The lamps cast long, soft shadows across the path, the air smelled faintly of autumn, and the park, this ordinary silent park, had become ours. And in that quiet, imperfect, and tender space we stayed. Together.